All right, folks. So thanks again for joining today's webinar. This is the California Transit Association Zoom to Zero Fundamentals of Battery Electric Bus webinar. It's being co-hosted by our friends at CALSTART. It's the first part in a four-part series and follows the four-part series we had hosted with the California Hydrogen Business Council on hydrogen fuel cell technologies and their potential for satisfying the requirements of the Innovative Clean Transit Regulation. So we have done some cross-promotion between our membership at the California Transit Association and the folks at CALSTART. And so I just want to provide a quick overview of who we are as an association. And as we get farther down into the program, Fred will be doing the same. Fred Silver will be doing the same for CALSTART. Now, the California Transit Association represents more than 200 transit-affiliated entities across the country, including more than 80 transit agencies in California. Our chief focus is advocating for policies and funding solutions that support and advance public transit. And we were tipped the spear for negotiating the parameters of the Innovative Clean Transit Regulation with the California Air Resources Board. Now we're focused now on implementation of the ICT regulation, and we're approaching it in a three-pronged fashion, focusing on advocacy, outreach, and education like today's webinar, as well as compliance, which of course will become more of a consideration as folks let out with their zero-emission bus deployments and attempt to reach scale as anticipated by the ICT regulation. Now, before I turn things over to Yaochen Chow from the California Air Resources Board, I'm just going to give you a quick overview on how to ask questions throughout this webinar. You should see at the far right of your screen an option to ask questions using the GoToWebinar feature. We'll be taking in questions throughout this webinar and throughout the presentations, and then we'll be harvesting those questions and reserving them for the very tail end of this webinar. So if there's anything that's of interest to you, please document it within this question box, and we'll be sure to get to it at the end of the webinar. Now, in the event that you've got a question that is particular to any one speaker, it would be helpful if you identified who the question is intended for. We'll make sure that that person is able to respond to that question. And then finally, in the event that we don't get to everyone's questions, we will make sure that we document who it is that asked the question and get it to the appropriate participant on this webinar and see to it that your question is answered. So at this point in time, I'm going to hand things over to Yaochen Chow at the California Air Resources Board. She serves as the Zero Emission Truck and Bus Section Manager and was one of our chief points of contact at the California Air Resources Board for the development of the ICT regulation. So Yaochen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. I also want to thank California Transit Association and CALSTART for inviting ARB here today. I'm Yaochen Chow, the manager of Zero Emission Truck and Bus here at ARB. A lot of you probably know me through the rulemaking process from the ICT, the Innovative Clean Transit Regulation. So the ICT regulation on slide 6, it has a very unique feature, which is the rollout plan requirement that most other regulations don't. The reason is because planning is very important for zero-emission bus deployment. In the rollout plan, we ask each transit agency to identify suitable technologies, understand the timeline for infrastructure construction, and also how all that can play into bus purchase schedule. So on slide 7, one of the biggest changes about deploying zero-emission buses, as opposed to buying conventional diesel or natural gas bus, is that we really need to have a synchronization of many elements. Transit agencies have to buy the suitable buses, make sure that the infrastructure is in place when buses are delivered, and to understand the fuel cost, especially when it comes to battery electric buses. Why is it important to understand these elements? We're going to make a little bit more explanation here. First, we want to buy the suitable buses. I kept repeating the suitable buses because we really don't want transit agencies go ahead to purchase a bus and end up not using them. We want to make sure that we buy the kind of buses that can provide the range that we need. Secondly, a transit agency needs to be able to control its budget. If not managed right, sometimes we can have a surprise when we see the electricity bill while operating battery electric buses, especially for the on-route charging when it's being utilized. The third element here is the infrastructure installation time frame and also the power needs. A transit agency may not have to upgrade its power supply when only deploying a small amount of battery electric buses. However, to convert the entire fleet would possibly require certain power upgrade, and sometimes that kind of power upgrade could take 3 to 5 years. So for all these important reasons, let's spend a few minutes talking about each of these elements. And first, we'll talk about range in slides 9 through 11. In the past few years, we have heard a lot of discussions about nominal range versus real-world range. And very often we're thinking about, what does that mean? The very first time I learned about the term nominal distance was when I was in college, when I was studying marine environment. In maritime operation, nominal distance refers to the maximum distance a light can be seen. So as we can tell in this slide, in the picture, that weather actually plays a big factor here in terms of how far we can see a light. If there's a fog, well, the distance shortens. If it's stormy, the distance shortens even further. Though the terminology is quite completely used in the same way, but we can still kind of translate some relationship to a battery electric bus's range and its contributing factors here. So we're going to discuss a little bit more in slide number 6. Slide 6 lists some of the common, slide 10, not 6, slide 10, Michael, sorry. Slide 10 lists some common factors that would affect a battery electric bus's range, such as terrain, such as the use of HVAC, driver's behavior, and also the frequency of stops, etc. There are ways to mitigate the situation and extend the range. From this slide, we can also tell that some of these factors are actually interrelated. First, it is important to conduct route simulation to understand how range is affected by the conditions of the routes. Not everybody's routes are the same. So even though we sometimes, we get information from other people's routes, but that can only be used as a reference. It's also very, very useful that each agency you understand your route, how your routes affect the range. Some bus manufacturers, they have been providing transit agencies an opportunity for such tests in order to understand the real-world range needs. If you happen to have this opportunity, you may really want to grab it. Second, we can increase the bus's fuel efficiency in order to extend the range. Two common ways of doing so are to first improve drivers' driving skills, and the other one will be reduce vehicles' weight. While we are talking about reducing vehicles' weight, we also have to discuss selecting suitable technologies. most people know that depot charging could be less expensive and easier to deploy. However, the trade-off here is that it also has a higher battery weight, and that could reduce the payload capacity and also fuel efficiency. Therefore, sometimes on-route charging is used to extend the range and also increase fuel efficiency. In slide 11, we have a few examples about battery electric buses fuel efficiency. These are all examples from NREL's reports featuring different models and also charging strategies. Though the weather conditions and the terrains might be different, but this kind of a reference represent a good ballpark range of fuel efficiency especially for urban operations. And we can also see that different charging styles sometimes may also affect the efficiency a little bit because of the charger efficiency. So now we have talked about range. Now let's transition to the topics on infrastructure and the fuel cost management. In order to conduct such discussion, we have to understand electricity consumption and the power needs for both chargers and the entire facility. So here we are on slide 12 to talk about energy and the power. Very often people are very confused by kilowatt versus kilowatt hour and don't quite know about their respective rules. So basically, kilowatt hour is a unit of energy. Energy is the ability to create some changes, such as to create some movement or motion. In the battery electric bus case, energy will be the electricity. Kilowatt on the other hand, is a measure of the rate, how fast energy is transmitted. So with this being said, we probably are still confused or maybe getting even more confused at this point. So let's maybe give another example that I think everyone can understand. So on slide 13, we're going to use a pool example to explain the relationship between energy and power. Let's not think about electricity or buses for a moment. This is a perfect day to think about a happy pool on a 100-degree day. We have a 10,000-gallon pool that we want to fill up. The needed fuel for the pool will be 10,000 gallons of water. We have to pay for 10,000 gallons of water. However, the water price might be higher if we are in a drought. Therefore, the cost of filling up a pool might vary based on whether water is a scarcity at the time. To be able to enjoy the pool water today instead of tomorrow, we may want to fill up this pool faster. Then we'll need a bigger pipe. However, a bigger pipe sometimes is much more expensive. Now that we understand how pool can be filled up, let's take this concept with us back to the battery electric bus energy cost and also infrastructure needs. So we'll be talking about energy cost for battery electric buses in slides 14 through 16. Energy cost, in this case, is the electricity cost. Unfortunately, electricity cost structure is way more complicated than water cost structure. Normally, electricity cost is affected by a few factors, including total electricity consumption. You will have to pay more on water if you have a 20,000 gallon pool instead of just a 10,000 gallon pool. Electricity rate, which is often coupled with time of use, and also demand charge. Demand charge is per meter based. There could be pros and cons of having multiple meters on site if it's allowed. What's really challenging here is that this is not a linear relationship. There's no linear relationship amongst these factors, so that we have to be kind of very careful. The next slide, slide 15, is an example of electricity cost. This is the electricity cost per kilowatt hour for Foothill Transit Agency between 2014 and 2018. This is a total of 4.5 years worth of data here. Before the end of 2015, Foothill was in Southern Cal Edison's experimental rate and did not have to pay for demand charge. Starting 2016, Foothill was moved into Edison's ED rate because the experimental rate had expired. Therefore, we are seeing magenta color on our right-hand side representing the demand charge cost. Both electricity rates, before the end of 2015 and also for 2016 and on, both electricity rates, they are time of use based. And we can really see the average allocation of electricity cost from different charging times, such as on-peak, mid-peak versus off-peak. From this chart, I think we can learn a few things. First, demand charge is definitely triggered by Foothill's battery electric fleet size. I remember that they started with 13 buses, but normally I believe that route can be serviced using 7 or 8 buses. When it has a time of use rate structure, we should really expect a higher electricity rate during summertime. In addition, the electricity costs for the two rates are actually pretty close to each other if we look at them, closely, even when the ED rate has a demand charge applied. This actually provides a lot of implications as to what type of electricity rate design would really benefit a transit agency and also the way they are charging their buses. However, this Foothill case is still kind of considered as a small deployment. We still have a lot to learn when it comes to a large deployment or full conversion. So slide 16 talks about ways to mitigate electricity costs, such as we take advantage of off-peak charging. However, things may not always be under an ideal circumstance. Demand charge is also very easy to trigger. The bottom line here is, if a charger or multiple chargers are using the same meter, and if the meter can be all the chargers under the meter can be better utilized, then it can really help reduce the average electricity cost per mile. Starting slide 17, we'll transition into the discussion about the power needs, which is important for us to understand the infrastructure needs. Remember the pool example we used earlier, that power can be considered as the pipe for water because depends on the pipe size. It can deliver water faster or slower. If we have a bigger pipe, it's faster to fill the pool. If the facility has enough power, then we can charge the buses faster in a shorter time. In considering the power needs, we should also assume everything that needs to be powered on site is turned on at the same time. So that would include both the existing power usage and also the expected new power needs. In slide 18, I want to use 4 simple examples to illustrate the pros and the cons of different power designs. Before we dive into these examples, I like to bring up the pool example one more time. Having a bigger pipe can fill up the pool faster, but it also means a higher cost for the pipe. However, if time is of essence, that we have to enjoy the pool water by a certain time, we may have to go with a bigger pipe regardless of the cost. There could be a trade-off here between charging time and the infrastructure cost as well. So that's the implication. So in this slide, all of these 4 examples here are to charge 200 battery electric buses each night. The first 2 examples are using high power charging at a rate of 250 kilowatt. The first example will charge all the 200 buses at the same time without arranging shifts. This example will probably require some major upgrade or on electricals, and also will require a brand new substation. The second example, however, divides the charging into 4 different shifts so that it reduces power needs dramatically. However, 12.5 megawatt is still a pretty big number when it comes to domestic commercial power supply. Fleets that are currently operating on natural gas buses, you probably know that if you are trying to compress your natural gas and fuel your 200 buses, your on-site power need probably is less than, I'm guessing, 2 megawatt. For diesel fleets, I would assume that it requires even lower power needs because it doesn't really take a lot to pump liquid fuels. Example 3 and 4 are both slow charging at a rate of 60 kilowatt. Example 3 charges all buses in one shift. Therefore, a higher power is needed. But even so, it has a similar power need as example 2. For example 4, they basically divide the entire fleet into 2 shifts for slow charging, which will bring down the power needs further to 6 megawatt. The actual charging situation here could actually be much more complicated in the real world due to transit agency's bus schedule and the labor union agreement. However, we can still learn a few things here from these 4 very simplified examples. First, when high power charging is applied, arranging charging shifts is much easier and could potentially bring down the infrastructure cost and the construction time. Secondly, slow charging may not allow multiple shifts for a large transit agency that has, especially if they have a very short charging window. So it may seem that there is a trade-off between charging time and the infrastructure upgrade. However, for a large agency, especially when we are going into the stage of full conversion, there may not be a lot of options on the table. So with all being said, slide 19, a few final words here. Planning is absolutely essential and important for infrastructure. Most transit agencies don't have the expertise to conduct this type of analysis on its own because of the very complicated power design, power availability, and the permitting process. It is therefore extremely important to involve your utility in the planning process before you decide what kind of zero emission buses to buy. Through your discussion with your utility, then we can also discuss how to optimize the infrastructure scale up so that the cost can be minimized and the time can be shortened to the extent possible. In addition, parking arrangements and the charger locations are also important for consideration. So this kind of concludes my presentation here. I truly appreciate once again CTA and CALSTART to design the series about battery electric bus deployment. Information provided today is extremely simplified and for illustration only. Moving forward, we do want to work with utilities and the technology providers more closely so that we can learn from each other, understand each other's needs. Therefore, design programs that would work for the transit riders and the California transit agencies California transit agencies are serving and supporting. So this last slide contains ARB's staff contact information, including myself. With that, I'm turning this back to Michael.
All right, thank you, Yao-Chen, for that presentation and for going over the fundamentals of energy, power, and all the things you need to know as you're deploying a battery electric bus. So, folks, I am going to remind you that you do have the opportunity to ask questions throughout this webinar. We're starting to field questions from folks, and we'll be sharing those at the very tail end of this webinar after we move through Fred Silver's presentation. So at this point in time, I am going to turn things over to Fred Silver. He's the Vice President at CALSTART, and our organizations have worked very closely together throughout the years on things like the HVIP program, securing new resources for that program, and then most recently on legislation to provide a sales tax exemption for zero-emission bus purchases, which for those of you not tracking the workings in Sacramento, that bill has been delivered to the governor's desk, and we're very excited about that. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn things over to Fred, and Fred, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for initiating our involvement and having us co-host with you on today's and the series of webinars coming up. This is a very exciting area for us. Myself, I'm passionate about helping the industry succeed and provide technical solutions for moving forward with cleaner and more efficient transit bus technologies. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see that CALSTART is a large 220 membership-based organization comprising of all the bus makers, component makers, a lot of government regulators and transit fleets. We have about 52 fleets in our organization, and so we're very excited to be a really outstanding way to network the industry and make sure they can get solutions fast and get to the right folks in the industry. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see that for the most part, people have thought that we're California-centric, like our name, but over the last 7 years of our 25 years of working in this industry, we've had what I call is a pulling sound to get outside of California. We now have 9 offices, and including 4 field offices. You'll see in California we have 3 regional locations in Berkeley, Fresno, and then Pasadena, and then 2 field locations in Stockton and then up in Sacramento. Going on to the next slide. The purpose of this wonderful picture is to show that the buses are out there and now available, and the majority of these have been Altoona tested and are available for federal funds. If not, they were there last week when I was over in State College. I saw a number of these going through the last test. So these are buses that seem to be making pull-out. They are, in fact, making pull-out. We've gotten past the point of prototypes for the most part. The major bus OEMs, New Flyer, Gillig, BYD, Complete Coachworks, and others are providing ongoing products. Every type and size. Years ago, the issue was, for many transit operators, the size of the needs of the bus wasn't available. We have a bigger array of products available, everything ranging from 40-foot buses from a number of battery electric buses from a number of manufacturers. We've got a number of double-decker buses, and this is a whole new space. We've seen 3 properties now start thinking about 20 or 30 electric double-decker buses, thinking outside of the box to save on their land space. And then cutaway buses. We're working with Phoenix Motor Coach with their bus to actually run it through Altoona and make it fundable from the FTA. We're doing a lot of work on the motor coaches that are now available from BYD and Motor Coach Industries. Motor Coach BYD has their vehicles going through the last legs of Altoona testing, and 40 will be deployed in Lancaster. Trolley buses, a number of fuel cell buses. On the right side there, you've got a whole array of fuel cell buses that are available, and even buses that are of the trolley type or repowers, like the one in the lower left-hand corner, which you can actually may make sense for you. Sometimes you have these old gasoline hybrid buses that are no longer supportable or other challenging issues, and you can continue to repower the bus, and those funds are available from the FTA to support that repower as well as the HVIP program in the state of California. So a great array of buses are now available, and if we move on to the next slide, we could talk about how the number of buses have grown dramatically. This is preliminary count. We'll be issuing our report in the next 30 days, a detailed report on where these buses are. These numbers are being tuned, but right now our preliminary count is that nationwide there are 2,203 buses either that have been funded in RFP stage or are deployed nationwide. About the vast majority today are battery electric, but as you go through your corridor analysis, you may find that the fuel cell buses may make a lot more sense. There's a lot more attention being provided on those these days, as well as people are getting to scale and have to weigh the cost of their infrastructure. In California, it looks like our preliminary count looks at about 1,016 buses, with about 964 of those being battery and 52 being fuel cell buses. And then we've been working with the Federal Transit Administration that's how we were established 25 years ago. So cooperative agreements ever since, and we helped them develop their electric drive strategic plan in 2009, which they set an objective of reaching 12,000 zero-emission buses cumulatively by 2030. I think it looks like we're right now on a glide path to exceed that. And then the breakout regions in the country, of course, California is number 1 with its innovative clean transit rule. Midwest, of all places, is number 2, with Indiana being probably having some of the largest deployments in the country. And then also the folks at Canton, Ohio, having one of the largest fleets of fuel cell buses. The Pacific Northwest with their low-cost electricity being number 3, and then just keep your eyes out for Florida. $130 million from VW funding being pumped into zero-emission buses, and there's a lot of interest going on there, and they're going to be the next breakout state for zero-emission bus deployment. So buses seem to be making pullouts. They're being ordered. People are figuring out ways to supplement funding to deal with the incremental costs. If we go on to the next slide set, we'll see this is an old slide from CARB. I don't have the latest one up, but you'll see here in California, I think it's more than 40 properties, and the numbers keep growing, so I'm probably missing a few here. But we do have properties in California like Stanford that have 40 buses out. We have the University at Irvine, about 30 to 40 buses out. We have Antelope Valley that is moving towards 100 buses. About 20 buses at the folks in Foothill. Los Angeles DOT about to place an order for 112 buses to go 25% zero emissions. So people are now looking at getting to scale in California, where the rest of the country is still probably looking at their demo size fleets of 5 to 10 just to get their arms around it. California is clearly at the forefront, and all the lessons learned, a lot of the benefits will go to the rest of the country. So if we go on to the next slide set, we'll see that infrastructure is, some buses seem to be moving out. They're available, they're working, but the real challenge now that we're going to scale, and that we're learning here probably first in California, is the near-term infrastructure challenge. And Yachun did an excellent job of talking about peak demand charges. But one thing that would help you is to understand the scale of the infrastructure that's needed and not usually available at the depot sites that are usually set aside for hosting these vehicles. So this chart here on the left-hand side shows the megawatts, the peak load megawatts that are required. And of course, that's the rate of power that's required that Yachun talked about. So this is now a megawatt that we're looking at. And then, of course, if you compare these different fleets, if you look at a fleet of 100 Chevy Volts, not too much in terms of 330 kilowatts of power required. If you look at a fleet of 100 medium-duty trucks, about 1.5 megawatts, now you're talking about something. It's Transamerica Pyramid Building in San Francisco, 2.1 megawatts of power, and just a small fleet of 50 electric buses, you're looking at 3 megawatts. So the infrastructure challenge of having skyscraper size infrastructure investments by the utility and yourself is the really next pioneering challenge for our properties as we get to scale. This has not been so much an issue with the first 5 to 10 buses that people are deploying, because for the most part, they generally have excess power. They can adapt to that. When they start getting into the 20s, 30s, 50s, and 100s, there's a whole new game. And Yachun did talk about sometimes the infrastructure taking as long as 3 to 5 years, in the worst case, to kind of get deployed. So plan is what we're going to be talking about here. If we move on to the next slide. Very much in line with what Yachun was saying. I can't say enough to plan. On the right side, you'll see there are all those wonderful planning elements that you really need to consider. You need to do your own vehicle inventory analysis and timing for deployment of and which technology you're going to deploy. You need to understand the vehicle performance versus route analysis. And in this case, it's not only for the 1 or 2 transit buses that might be willing to offer you the bus to demonstrate. You might be competing your buses, and there might be a choice of 4 or 5 options. And frankly, they're all different. So each bus will perform differently. Just because one bus operates properly on your site doesn't mean another bus will, given the different variety of energy storage options on there and the different energy efficiencies those buses offer. You need to lay out your energy requirements. What's your cost and budget likely to look like? Your facility requirements. What's your charging strategy going to look like? You need to figure out how to get smart systems. We talked about it is complicated, the utility bill. There are now software systems that will do that math for you. So you need to get smart about whether you want to subscribe to somebody's system or you want to buy and manage your own software system. And they can actually dispatch your buses as well. So you can actually see what's going on in the field, change routes if you had to, pull a bus in if you have to. The final infrastructure planning of what the amount of power that you need to bring in looks like and what the layout's going to look like. Preliminary electrical drawings, maybe not the final drawings, but just the layout. And the utility application for new service, that is not a simple sheet. We just filled out one for the city of LA, and it took us 4 months to get that filled out properly. So there are a lot of things on these utility applications that you may not even be aware of that you need. Methane studies, a variety of other activities that you may not have done before. So you need to kind of get one of those forms in front of you and just see if there's anything you need to be doing in that space before you can start moving out. Here's the good news. The good news is that Caltrans planning funding is here today and available. In fact, it's available on the street right now. The proposals are due the 11th. They come out. It comes out twice a year. The Sustainable Communities grants do encourage this kind of planning, and it does allow for zero-emission bus street feasibility studies and all these other kind of plans that we've talked about on the right side. The grants range anything from a $50,000 grant for a DAC to up to $1 million. Cost share is somewhat reasonable at 11.7%. And nonprofits are eligible sub-applicants. In fact, we have 8 such studies ongoing at CalSTART at this time. So we are somewhat growing in our expertise in this space. In 2018, there is a working group that reviewed the opportunity and asked CalSTART to write, and then we were selected for a transit bus electrification study for the cities of Pasadena, Burbank, and Glendale. And we would be happy to take your phone call and assist on any of these studies. It's very timely. If you are interested in this, I'd encourage you to get to us as soon as possible. But these are very friendly studies, high probability of winning these studies. They want to give you this work if you lay out the statement of work properly. To go on to the next slide. So just to kind of give you some of the ideas, some of the things that Yachun was talking about, CalSTART has spent quite a bit of money, just about $60,000 recently, on working with some universities to develop a sophisticated algorithm to do electric bus corridor modeling. And depending on which, we could put any bus type with any energy storage type, with any of the accessories on your route, your specific route, and we can analyze the performance, the likely performance of that bus, and to make some regular recommendations. We have all sorts of outputs that come out of this document and are available to you, and we try to do it in a simpler way possible, so it's maybe one corridor, once we get going, it only takes us about 1 to 2 hours of work to perform. And then, of course, there's report writing on top of that and recommendations. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see the way we do this. The process is we work with the fleet manager. We have about a half-hour conversation by phone. We ask about the buses, the routes, the charging station designs that you may be predisposed for, but not always finally selecting. We gather data from publicly available reports. Altoona, obviously, you're going to be working with a transit bus for the most part that has gone through standardized testing. There are great reports there that show the performance of the bus on the flats, and that is the basics for some of the modeling that we do, but it gets sophisticated because we do add in all the inclines and declines and weighting, and the HVAC system and the climate conditions, and we run the model. If we go on to the next slide. And out of this model, you'll get a significant amount of results for each route. And now that you all understand kilowatt hours, I'm sure, you'll find out what the rate is during 4 seasons, which is really important, because just because your average, NREL provides a fine report that averages this all out, but you really need to know what your daily worst case consumption is, what's the most challenging lap of the day, and the daily state of charge changes that you're going to need for each of the seasons of the year, and we're able to analyze that and break that out in terms of whether it's traction power, or some of the accessories or that are driving these energy needs. If you go on to the next slide. And then on top of that, we're able to really do some fine work in helping you really figure out what your ultimate charging strategy might look like. In the case of battery electric, which is typically either depot-related charging, and there are depot chargers out there with multiple ports, and you could do sequential charging. You know, we could also add sophisticated smart charging systems on top of that, as well as looking at whether you need a opportunity charging system at high power rates, because you need the ability to run many hours a day over great range of miles per day with a very narrow window of time to charge these buses. So This is all available to you on and accessible under this Caltrans planning grant. If that's something you're interested with, again, please let us know. We think this is really timely and important as you move forward with your plans. This is an example. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see this an example of a program we're running for 3 properties in the Verdugo Canyon. And the nice thing, if you bring in your sister property, there are opportunities for shared resources on some of these charging applications. So that's the nice thing about, we're more than happy if there's 2 or 3 of you that are all contiguous. That works out very nicely because you can actually reduce your investment costs by looking at shared possibilities amongst each other. So that's something that we'd encourage you to think about as well. So going on to the end, the last slide, you'll see my name and contact information. I encourage you to give us a call and consider if you want just general advice about our membership program, about the ability to do planning grants, do modeling, or just general information in general. We're here to help you, and you've got my contact information there. And I'll turn you back over to Michael.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Fred, for that presentation. Folks, I do want to remind you that you have the ability to ask questions throughout this webinar. We've collected a few already. We'll be turning to them shortly. I'll give folks another 30 seconds or so to get some questions in so we can have some Q&A discussion. All right, so I'm going to turn to the first question. It comes to us from Savannah Gill at Civic Spark, and this is directed at Fred and the folks at CALSTART. Fred, when you were talking about some of the planning grants, you mentioned that there was a cost share of roughly 11.7%. Savannah is just curious about what exactly that means.
Well, that means, let's say you ask for $500,000, that they'll provide you with $450,000, and you would share the other $50,000, rough order of magnitude, of your own investment in that study. If you do it at $100,000, okay, it's a $10,000 investment.
Fantastic. So, Fred, two more questions for you. The first comes from Jorge Duran at OCTA, and he asks, in the plan slide, what does it mean when you say that CALSTART is an allowable sub-applicant?
Under the Caltrans planning grant, they only allow not-for-profits. Otherwise, they compete consultants. So we can go in, and what we offer to do in these cases, we'll write the proposal for you, so you don't have to go out and do that. We know how to do it well. We have a very sophisticated Caltrans grant writer on staff who, that's all the person does is write PAIRCP and Caltrans planning grants. It's very good at this. So we'll write that, and if you're willing to submit it, and we'll work with you on that. So we are an eligible sub-applicant. Otherwise, and you can get started real fast out of the gate without having to compete the consultancy. Otherwise, you can go ahead and do it yourself, and then you can either use the planning grant for your own staff, or you can go out and compete a not-for-profit to do that work for you. So there are other consultant entities out there that do this work. We're not the only one, but if they're a not-for-profit, they're eligible to go right in. You don't have to go through the competition process.
All right, thank you, Fred. Last question for you comes from Don Curry at North County Transit District. And he notes that your presentation speaks to battery electric buses and their costs, and he wonders if you have comparative cost data for fuel cell electric buses and their fuel requirements and costs. More specifically, he's wondering how much power is required to fuel a hydrogen fuel cell bus, and how much would that fuel costs. Is that data that you have available, and we'll stipulate probably not on offhand, but generally?
Yes, generally we have that available. CalSTART established the National Fuel Cell Bus Program. We've invested in more than maybe $150 million in developing the first, in fact, all the first developed buses, the American fuel cell, all the buses designed and operated at Sunline were a development of CalSTART funded by the FTA through our idea. We also just deploying the nation's first articulated bus that is being deployed up in at AC Transit, and we're also just finishing off the work on a battery, a small fuel cell, large battery bus, so that we can drive the costs down with these fuel cell buses and get the benefit of a small fuel cell and the benefit of the lower battery costs that are emerging, and have a lower cost vehicle. So we are immersed in the fuel cell side today. So, and I don't mean to diss our members, because many of our members are fuel cell members. We believe in both technologies. We're fuel neutral, and we do see very clearly where the advantages of one are versus the other, and we are in a good position to help you make a decision across the two technologies.
All right, thank you, Fred. So that takes us to the end of the questions we received. And folks, you can feel free to send me an email after this webinar if you have any questions that are kind of late coming for you, and I'll make sure to farm them out as appropriate. I do want to remind you, however, of the subsequent webinars in this series. We've got a number coming up. The next one is, in fact, next Thursday, and it's focused on the experience of battery electric buses on the road. That will be followed the following Wednesday by best practices for EV infrastructure. And I'll just mention for all of you, we chose Wednesday as opposed to Thursday because we recognize many of you, including myself, will be at CTE's International Zero Emission Bus Conference in San Francisco. So we hope you'll be able to join this in addition to that conference. And then finally, on Thursday, October 3rd, we'll have a webinar on Fund the Electric Fleet, highlighting all the various funding programs that are available to you as transit agencies to offset the incremental costs of these technologies. And then very finally, I'll mention that on our CTA website, under events, we have a tab for webinars. That's where this webinar presentation, as well as all other webinars in the series, will be hosted for posterity. You'll be able to access both the recorded video, or I should say audio, aspects of this presentation, as well as the PDF for the PowerPoint itself. And then I'll also note that we have currently the analog webinar series that we hosted with the California Hydrogen Business Council on fuel cell electric technologies. That 4-part series lives there as well. You know, as a technology neutral association, we want to make sure that we're providing you with information on both potential fuel paths, and you know, we look forward to continuing to have some conversations about these battery electric bus technologies. So with that, I'll leave you with my contact information. Again, you can send me an email if you have any questions. I'm also the staff liaison to our Zero Emission Bus Task Force. It's there that we help develop the association's advocacy, education, and compliance program for all of our members. So if you have anything that's particular to that domain, you can feel free to send me an email. I'll make sure to work with our chair, Doran Barnes of Foothill Transit, to get it on one of our meeting agendas. So I want to thank you all for joining this morning. Hope that you can join for the subsequent webinars in this series. And with that, we'll be signing off. Thank you so much.